Hey everybody, this is a video lecture to replace our normal lecture for the first part of talking about physiological needs. Today's lecture covers the types of needs and hunger, and then next time we're going to talk about sex. Yeah, we're going to talk about sex. So to start us out with, to think about the question of the day, I'd like you to take a moment, pause the video, and take, say, 90 seconds to write out your answers to these questions. What's your favorite food? Why do you like it so much? And to what extent are your preferences based on innate factors versus learned preferences? In other words, would anybody anywhere in the world at any point in time love the same food as you? Do you like it because of some learned preference, because of your exposure to it, etc.? So take 90 seconds or so and write your own response to this. Before we get into the actual lecture, I have a couple of housekeeping things to remind you of. Number one, remember that your group assignment 1 was due on Blackboard 9 a.m. today. That is to say, Wednesday. If you haven't turned it in yet, do it, especially if your group is counting on you and you're the group captain for this first assignment. You need to have that in. Your group members will be very teed off at you for not getting in it on time. If you missed class on Monday, per the syllabus policy, you need to complete the group assignment on your own. Double check the syllabus policy for details on what happens if you weren't in class for a group assignment. Second housekeeping announcement, remember that your motivation project paper 1 is due on Blackboard this Friday at 9. If you have questions or if you weren't here when I talked about that previously, check out the syllabus for details. And then finally, now that you're getting your first paper done, you should start thinking about the second paper. Yes, it seems like it's coming very quickly on the heels of the first paper, but the motivation project paper 2 is more in depth, and it will require looking ahead in your book. It will require thinking about strategically how to choose theories that are going to be a good fit for your behavioral choice that you've come up with for your first paper. That is due Friday, February 10th at 9 a.m. on Blackboard. The description of that paper assignment is in your syllabus. It's also posted on Blackboard, so do visit that before too long so you can start getting your ideas for what theories you want to look at. Okay, let's talk about needs. What is a need? At a very broad level, a need is any condition within the person that is essential and necessary for life, growth, and well-being. So note that we're talking about stuff within the person. This is not an external force upon you. This is something within you, and it's essential. It is necessary. You must have it. It's not, oh, that'd be kind of nice, but you actually must have it for life, to stay alive, for growth, and for well-being. Note that these are not just physical needs. We're going to be talking about physiological needs for this chapter, and then next week we're going to talk about psychological needs. So it's not just physical stuff, but that's part of it. What happens if our needs are met? Well, generally speaking, if your needs are nurtured, they're satisfied, you have well-being. You're healthy, you are able to grow, you are going to stay alive, your bodily self is enhanced. If, on the other hand, if your needs are neglected and frustrated and you don't have everything that you need, again, not luxuries, but necessities, it's going to produce damage. That damage might harm your biological well-being, it might harm your psychological well-being. So at its very core, the idea underlying motivation, and we've talked about this before, motivational states provide the impetus to act. They push you to do something before damage occurs to either your bodily well-being or your psychological well-being, right? So needs produce drives, and drives produce behavior. We're going to talk some more about that later on today. Motivational states are designed to reduce and prevent damage, or to mitigate damage if it does occur. Broadly speaking, we have 3 categories of needs, 3 types of needs. We have physiological needs, psychological needs, and social needs. Now this chart is adapted a little bit from one in your textbook, so it shouldn't look too awful unfamiliar to you. The current chapter that we're talking about, again, focuses on physiological needs. So these are things that are inherent within the workings of your biological systems. Things that are inborn, things that are genetically based, things that keep you alive, and that keep you physically healthy. Right? So these physiological needs drive you to do stuff that keeps you alive and that keeps you physically healthy. So the book has sections on thirst, which we skipped over reading, hunger, which we're going to talk about today, and sex, which we're going to talk about next time. But there are plenty of other physiological needs: sleep, an adequate body temperature, iron levels, all sorts of different things. The second category is psychological needs. So these are needs that are inherent within the strivings of human nature and healthy development. So things that are inherent within the strivings of human nature and healthy development. These are also universal to all humans. Just like physiological needs, these are inborn, these are innate, these are universal. They're things that everybody experiences. These are things like autonomy, competence, relatedness, right? So the ability to have some freedom over your life, to feel like you're good at what you do, to feel related to others. Those are needs. They're not just nice things to have. So we're going to talk about that in chapter 6 next week, I think. And then finally, we have this whole category of social needs. Now, one important difference between social needs and psychological needs is that psychological needs are universal. They are true of everyone. They are inborn. Social needs, on the other hand, are learned. They vary from person to person. How much of this social need I have is going to be different from how much of this same social need you have. So these are internalized or learned needs based on your emotional history and your socialization history with others. So this would include things like need for achievement, need for affiliation, need for intimacy, need for power. So we're going to talk some more about that when we get to chapter 7. Now note, some of those things under the social needs umbrella sound kind of similar to the things in the psychological needs umbrella, but they are in fact distinct. So autonomy is different from, competence is distinct from achievement. Relatedness is different from affiliation. Intimacy, I should also point out, is not the same as sex. So these are distinct kinds of needs that produce different behavioral consequences, and they act very differently on us. So for today and next time, we're going to focus on those physiological needs, those physical, biological things that we all need. This is a Cliff's Notes version of a figure from your book, but I really like it as an overview of the need-drive behavior process. So I have a need, it stimulates a drive, the drive stimulates a behavior, the behavior reduces the need. Right? So that's the basic gist of what we're talking about. So up at the top, denoted number 1 here, is the satiated state, or a feeling of satiety, it's pronounced. If you've been seeing that term in your book and you're like, how is that pronounced? I've always heard it pronounced satiety, so it looks like satiety. When you're in a satiated state, you feel contented, full, you're not thirsty, you're not anemic, you're not exhausted, you're just feeling pretty good. So you may be in a satiated state, and then gradually as time passes, your body uses energy and various hormones go to other parts of your body, and you use minerals and so on and so forth. So gradually over time, you develop physiological deprivation. You have lower levels of X than you did when you were in your satiated state. If that continues, if that physiological deprivation continues, as it does several times a day for many different bodily systems, you'll experience number 3, a bodily need. So this is a prolonged physiological deprivation that's going to produce bodily need, right? So you have this physiological deprivation, your body's water is being removed from your cells and being converted into urine, and it's being stored in your bladder, and so your cells are starting to get dried out. So the bodily need is this physiological need. Your body realizes that you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're tired, whatever the case might be. So you have this bodily physiological need, which is essentially, and we'll talk some more about this later, a discrepancy between your set point, the sort of ideal state of things, and where you are right now. So that represents a bodily or physiological need. Step number 4 in this diagram is when the need starts to intensify. Your body says, okay, I'm kind of thirsty now, and it turns into something at a conscious level. That's a psychological drive. So the psychological drive is your conscious realization of a bodily need. So a bodily need is sort of a lower level thing that you may or may not be aware of. Once you become aware of it, then we're talking about psychological drive territory. So you realize, oh man, I'm really hungry, or oh, I'm so exhausted, or I'm thirsty, or I'm horny, or whatever the case might be. When you actually realize it, that's a psychological drive. As we've seen before in the previous chapter, the previous unit, drives tend to motivate behavior. So step number 5 in this cycle is that goal-directed motivated behaviors occur as a way to gratify or reduce the drive, right? We talked about Hull's drive theory and the idea about drive reduction. We're motivated to reduce those unpleasant states, those drives. So I try to do something. If I'm thirsty, I'm going to start getting up to go to the sink, right? If I'm horny, I'm going to start doing something to go find a sexual partner, right? So that's what we're basically talking about. Number 6 is the consumatory behavior. This is where you actually go out and you consume something to reduce your drive, to reduce your need, right? So your consumatory behavior might be drinking a glass of water. It might be going to the restroom to relieve yourself of the uncomfortable feeling of fullness. It might be eating food so you're not so hungry, whatever the case might be. So that's your consumatory behavior. That in turn reduces the drive. That was the whole point of the motivated behavior, was to reduce the drive. And once your drive is reduced, you go back to baseline, this satiated state. Ah, I feel so much better. So let's go through this. If we were in class, I would have you pair up and go through this for an example of your choice. So if you'd like, excuse me, if you'd like, you can pause the video and choose some sort of physiological need, hunger, thirst, sleep, sex, whatever the case might be. Choose something like that, pause the video, and go through all 7 steps for the example you've chosen. So we'll do one really, really quickly here. Imagine that you are satiated because you just had a nice glass of water, you're feeling good, you're feeling replenished. Over time, your body starts to, again, some of that water goes into your bladder and gets leached out of other parts of your body, starts to have this physiological deprivation. If it goes on long enough, you'll have a bodily need where your body says, oh, I'm thirsty. That will then eventually translate into a psychological drive. You're suddenly made aware of the idea that you're thirsty. That will translate into motivated behavior, getting up off the couch. That might then translate into consumatory behavior, getting a drink of water and actually consuming it. That reduces my thirst drive, which puts me back into a satiated state. You can do the same process for any physiological need that we might talk about. Now, one more thing that I want to point out about this model, it's not our needs that motivate our behavior. It is our drives that motivate our behavior. In other words, let me use my pointer here. It's not number 3 that motivates my getting up and getting a drink behavior. It's number 4, my psychological drive, that does it. Consider this, right? Imagine I'm in a coma. I would have, at some times in the day, I would have a bodily need for water. Right? My body would say, hey, you're low on water, but I'm in a coma. I've got no psychological drives whatsoever. I've got no awareness of feelings of thirst. So I'm not going to engage in those downstream behaviors, right? I have to be consciously aware of whatever the psychological drive is in order for motivated behavior to occur. Generally speaking, how does this need-drive behavior process work? In a nutshell, we want to be at that satiated level, that level of satiety. Another word related to that is homeostasis. So we all have these internal processes, many, many internal processes, and we're always trying to get back to stasis. We're always trying to get back to a constant internal set of bodily conditions. So that's homeostasis. Our bodies are constantly and automatically, without us even doing anything about it, they're automatically trying to restore constancy or take us back to stasis after we've had some sort of um, disturbance or change in it. For instance, if you're hotter than you like to be, if your body temperature is too hot, you sweat so that the sweat evaporates and it cools you down. If you're too cold, your body says, hey, I'm too cold, I need to bring myself back up to homeostasis, so you shiver. That increases your body temperature and puts you back to the level that your body wants to be at. So that's the idea of homeostasis. Even so, we all have this idea of homeostasis. We're all trying to return to this middle ground. But the thing is, there are individual differences, right? I suspect very strongly that in our class, there are some people who tend to run hot, so to speak, right? People who are perpetually hot, who are very sweaty all the time. Everybody's always looking at them like, why are you wearing shorts in January? There are probably also people in the class who tend to run cold, like me. I am looking at my fingernails right now, and they are slightly purple. I am perpetually cold, right? So I have a particular set point, a homeostatic body temperature that I'm always trying to get back to. It just happens to be a little bit different than somebody else who runs hot. We'll talk about the idea of set point in a little bit, so I will hold off on that. But this tendency, this innate urge or self-correcting processes that set us back to homeostasis, they do that through what's called a negative feedback system. So it's a self-correcting process to reduce how much difference there is between your internal genetically set point and your actual current state of things. Right? So the negative feedback system says, oh, hey, I want my body temperature to be thus, but I'm actually at this other state. I'm going to shiver or I'm going to sweat in order to make that happen. So here's a metaphor for that I think is really helpful. Excuse me. It uses the metaphor of a furnace in your home. Right? So you set your thermostat at 68 degrees. That's what you want the temperature of the room to be. It's not always going to be 68 degrees, right? Like sometimes it goes down to 66 and sometimes it goes up to 71. Right? So you have this input, this set point that you are trying to keep the room at. There's some sort of comparator, some sort of thermostat or something that says, oh, okay, what's the difference between what I want the temperature to be and what it actually is? And anytime there's a discrepancy, your furnace kicks on or your air conditioner kicks on. Right? So the furnace says, oh no, I'm too cold, I need to get back up to 68. The furnace turns on, and then that generates heat, which raises the house temperature, which is feedback back into this comparator system. Right? So the comparator says, okay, what's the actual temperature? 68 degrees. What is it supposed to be? 68 degrees. Awesome, I'm going to turn off. Then, of course, the house temperature is going to continue to fluctuate, so maybe the air conditioner kicks on or the furnace kicks on again, right? So, but the point is that this cycle over here continues over and over and over constantly. And this comparator, this checking system, occurs very frequently as our bodies, or in this case, the thermostat, checks to see, am I close enough to what I need to be? Am I close enough to what I need to be? Am I close enough to what I need to be? If not, I need to do something to fix it. It may be helpful to you to pause the video here and try to apply this model to some physiological need of your choice. If you can apply it to the same example you used for the need drive behavior activity with the like circular model that we talked about. So see if you can identify an example of a set point. You don't have to know biology to do this, but do it for hunger or do it for thirst. I want to be at a normal level of water intake, right? And then complete the rest of this based on your very basic understanding of what you do to get back to homeostasis. So again, negative feedback is just our body's attempt to help us get back to what our bodies want to be. The thing is, people are more complex than furnaces. And in reality, there are a lot of things going in that increase or decrease our drive, and then our drive can increase or decrease behaviors in a lot of different ways. So we have a lot of inputs, these antecedent conditions on the left, and we have a lot of various outputs, behavioral consequences on the right. So let's pretend we are trying to decide how much to eat. So you have a plate, there's food in front of you, you're trying to figure out how much to put on the plate so that you can feed yourself. The antecedent conditions, the things that influence your drive in this particular circumstance, might include things like your prior learning history. What foods do you like? What foods do you dislike? It might include how recently you've eaten and what you ate. I just ate 5 minutes ago. I have a really low drive to eat right now. It might include whether we're dieting or not. It might include your current social situation. Am I at a party? Am I eating dinner with my family? Am I at home alone? Is it Thanksgiving or some other holiday that's important to my family? Another antecedent condition might be how many food choices are available. If the book has this interesting examination of, it talks about ice cream sampling. So if I have 3 different flavors of ice cream to taste, I'll probably try all of them. If I only have one, I'll probably only try one. How attractively the food is presented, right? So all of these things are present in the environment or that influence the amount and direction of our drive. And then similarly, your behavioral consequences can be very complex, right? So how many different kinds of foods do you eat at this hypothetical meal? How many calories total do you consume? How quickly do you eat? How long does it take before you start eating? Do you go back for seconds? Do you go back for thirds? Right? So it's not just a case that you have a drive, you do a behavior, but it's also the case that a whole bunch of stuff influences your drive, and then your drive influences a whole bunch of downstream behaviors. Furthermore, there's a feedback loop so that the behavioral consequences I experience this time around at this meal with this plate of food has the potential to influence the antecedent conditions I experience in the future. For instance, I felt so sick after I ate that thing, I don't want to eat that again. That's going to change my antecedent conditions the next time somebody says, hey, do you want some of that? I'll say, no, absolutely not. Get lost. So we've been talking a lot about food. We've been talking a lot about hunger. Let's just hit that. We'll talk about hunger. We'll talk about eating today. Were we in class? This might be a little bit more helpful, but you can at least pause the video and take, let's say, 2 minutes to at least think to yourself. Even better would be to write out your responses to these questions. Describe your eating practices with your family growing up. What kinds of foods did you eat? Where did you eat and with whom? Were there rules about eating? What were the consequences for violating those rules? I'll give you a minute or a couple of minutes to pause and go through and come up with your own responses to that question. So I'll give some examples in my own family. You probably have different examples yourself. It's actually kind of funny. So I was the youngest of 4 children in a single parent household. So as you can imagine, there were times when money was really tight. And so my family ate a lot of, mac and cheese, not even the Kraft mac and cheese, because that's too expensive. You buy like the Best Choice and Always Safe brand mac and cheese. We had a lot of Hamburger Helper. We had ramen noodles. Like I would come home from school and I had this ramen noodle recipe down to a T. We had a lot of scrambled eggs, foods that are not super bad for you. Like we didn't have whole lots of sugar, for instance, but relatively high fat, very easy to prepare things that my mom could come home and whip something together and feed 4 children on the cheap. Usually we ate at the table, although as we got into teenage years that became more and more difficult, and I remember what a special treat it was to get to eat in front of the TV. So we had, TV stands that maybe once a month we would get out and eat our dinner in front of the TV. Oh, that's another thing. We would eat a lot of pot pies and a lot of TV dinners. Why? Because they're cheap, they're easy, they're fast, and the kids can prepare them themselves. But the funny thing is, when I met my husband and married into his family, his mom is an amazing cook. And she's the sort of person who does everything from scratch. And so in the 14 and a half years I've been married, she's never once made pot pies. She's never once made TV dinners. She's never once made macaroni and cheese out of a box. She's never once made hamburger helper. These were staples of my childhood diet. And so it sort of was really startling to me when I started to interact with my future husband and talk about the dining norms in his house, because they were very, very different. So anyway, that's just an example of the sort of norms and influence of sort of a mini culture that some people might have experienced. So let's talk really briefly about how hunger works, and then we'll talk some about the importance of culture in shaping our eating behavior. So in the short term, on a hour by hour basis or day by day basis, when we're talking about hunger, we have these glucostatic processes. So if you're saying for short term hunger, I'm basically saying, are you hungry right now? How do you know? What produces your current level of hunger? So the glucostatic hypothesis basically says that as time passes, your body uses glucose in your blood, and the amount of glucose goes down. When your glucose goes down to a particular level, you start to feel hunger. Again, this is very back of the envelope, very nutshell sort of summary, but that's the basic gist. There are two particular parts in your hypothalamus. The lateral hypothalamus, sends the hunger signals from your brain to the rest of the body. So those hunger signals are things like, my stomach is growling, my stomach feels empty, I'm paying attention, I'm like, oh, I'm really aware of how empty my stomach is. So those sorts of attentional processes take place in the lateral hypothalamus. When we eat food, it increases leptin, which is this particular type of hormone that's released by adipose tissues or fat tissues in our bodies. We all have fat tissues, so don't pretend you don't. So leptin is this hormone. It produces feelings of fullness, which motivate us to stop eating because, hey, I just fulfilled that drive. So when we eat food, it produces leptin. Leptin makes us feel full, and as a result, we stop eating. That's how it normally is supposed to work. If you have low levels of leptin, it makes your body say, I don't have enough energy to be doing this behavior. Try doing something lower energy instead. And so leptin actually, not only does it change our feelings of fullness, but it also changes our behaviors to be more or less vigorous. Unfortunately, you can't just inject somebody with leptin and say, hey, stop eating, go, this is going to be healthy and you can lose some excess weight. Because what actually happens is people will quickly acclimate to that extra leptin in their body and the effects will wear off. So that's not a substitute for appropriate exercise behavior and eating healthy. So in addition, I talked about the lateral hypothalamus. The ventromedial hypothalamus is slightly different. It's a very small area of your brain, but it does that negative feedback cycle that we talked about a moment ago that tells you to stop eating. If the ventromedial hypothalamus is damaged, animals will eat and eat and eat and eat, eventually doubling their body weight. So the lateral hypothalamus, the ventromedial hypothalamus are both really, really important. If there's damage to either of those areas, it's likely to lead to obesity, especially, we talk about this in animals in the lab, because the brain says, I'm always hungry, because you don't have that off switch, or never stop eating, because I never feel full. This is essentially, as far as we know, what causes Prader-Willi syndrome. My uncle had Prader-Willi syndrome. It's a condition, it's a genetically based condition in which people will literally eat themselves to death if they're allowed free access to food. It's really, really problematic. The motivational issue is that they feel like they're always starving. right? You know how it feels when you're just starving and you're like, all I can think about is food and I'm really, really motivated to go eat. Yeah, except that's how these people feel all the time. So their family members have to put locks on the refrigerators and locks on the cabinets because they'll sneak down after their parents are in bed and go and eat all this food. And so it's, people who have Prader-Willi syndrome often, typically, are overweight because their body is telling them eat, 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 because they don't have this stop mechanism that works properly. It doesn't work properly for them. So that's the short term. So here's my mice. In the longer term, how does hunger work? What motivates us to eat or to stop eating over a period of months or years? What long-term biological processes are there that influence our behavior? So remember, the short-term piece, we were talking about, I'm hungry right now. But for the longer-term stuff, we're talking about feelings like, I'm always hungry. Not right now, but over a longer period of time. The lipostatic hypothesis is the idea that, again, we've talked about set point before. So when I lose fat, I have an increased amount of ghrelin, which produces hunger. Now, ghrelin is a hormone that's manufactured in your stomach. That hormone gets put into your blood system. It's circulated. It's detected by the lateral hypothalamus, which we talked about for short-term hunger. This produces a physiological need that tells the brain, I'm low on food, I better eat something, right? So ghrelin says, you better eat, you better eat, you better eat. That produces this psychological drive of hunger and motivates your behavior to eat. So ghrelin, this hormone, it increases before meal times and it declines rapidly after you eat. The problem is, and there's going to be this theme and you can detect it in your reading as well, is with dieting, right? So let's say I go on a diet, I decrease my food intake, I lose some body fat, that actually increases my level of hunger. What that means is when you're on a diet, if you've ever experienced being on a diet and you're like, I'm hungry all the time, yup, that's because your body has more of this hormone than it's used to having, and you're feeling hungry more often. So then people have to mitigate that and they have to change their behaviors, or if they have to use conscious control of their behaviors, which, as your book talks about, can kind of backfire. So it's all a very complex story, but it starts to point to the reason why diets are really, really difficult to maintain long term, right? You might lose 10 pounds here, you might lose 20 pounds there, you might lose 100 pounds here, but long term, most of that weight tends to come back if all you did was diet. The other reason for that is this, as we've talked about a little bit before, the set point theory. Your fat cells have a natural set point, how large they are, how expanded they are. When your cells over time fall below your natural set point, hunger increases. Hunger arises more quickly, it arises more vigorously, more vehemently. You get hungry more easily and more quickly. So, if you have a natural set point for your weight and your weight gets below that set point, what your body is telling you, essentially what your body understands to be the case, is I'm starving. Why am I starving? There's not enough food in my environment. I need to produce this motivational state of hunger so that I go out and do something about it. So when you lose weight through dieting, it makes you hungry because you don't have the same amount of fat or same types of fat cell. Well, you still have the same types, but they shrink. And so your body says, hey, I'm starving. I need to do something about this. So, let's think for a moment about what this means for dieting. What does this imply? Well, whenever your body is below its genetically determined set point, you feel hungry more often because your body wants you to get back up to your normal weight, right? So even if you're so, quote unquote, successful at dieting, your body is still trying to get you to gain that weight back. And again, most of us eventually do. Set points clearly differ from person to person, just like some people are predisposed to be taller, some people are predisposed to be shorter. We also differ in our predisposition to carry more or less fat on our bodies and to carry fat in different places. We have different genetically set metabolic rates, right? So when we talk about things like fat shaming, and we say, we really shouldn't fat shame, it's not just a matter of saying, well, it's not their fault. No, I'm saying like there's a really strong genetic basis here. It's not entirely genetically based, so we're going to talk some about that later. But when people lose weight, their body says, gain that back. And so you're constantly fighting your body. The other thing about set point with regard to eating is that your set point for weight can change over your life. And for most people it does. For instance, starting in your 20s, your weight tends to increase slowly over your lifespan. Your metabolism drops, especially after you've done some sort of extended caloric restriction. So if you've gone on a diet for a long time, again, your body thinks, I'm being starved, right? There's food scarcity going on here. Body doesn't know what's going on in your brain. So it reduces your metabolism. So you don't burn as many calories, which makes it more and more difficult to maintain weight loss. On the other hand, if you engage in long-term excess caloric intake, that can increase both the number of fat cells in your body and their size. That in turn can increase your set point. So basically what happens is that your body gets used to having a little bit more fat, and then a little bit more fat, and then a little bit more fat. And so over time, your set point increases upward. Evolutionarily speaking, right, like let's think about what this means for our ancient ancestors. Evolutionarily speaking, it makes sense for our bodies to allow a little bit too much fat than a little bit too little fat, right? Like it's okay to have a little bit of extra padding, evolutionarily speaking, because if you go through a lean time, you're more likely to survive. So it's not symmetrical, right? Your bodies are more likely to tolerate a higher set point than a weight higher than your set point rather than a weight lower than your set point. As a side note, I have to admit, every time I think about this, I get a little bit scared because I have 2 boys, and right now they're 3 and 6, but dude, I think about what's going to happen in 10 years. I'm going to have 2 teenage boys in the house, fast metabolisms, bottomless pits, high levels of energy. I'm going to have to seriously budget for food. I don't know, you guys. It's going to be crazy. Okay. So let's think of it. So we've talked very much so far about this physiological processes involved in feelings of hunger and then what happens in terms of how we eat. And the book talks a lot more about this, but I wanted to go in a different direction and talk more about, since we spent a lot of time last time talking about the evolutionary perspective on motivation, I want to talk about how food and evolution are inextricably linked and how those things in turn relate to the current culture in which we find ourselves. We need food to stay alive, right? Food is a good thing. Food is an important thing. The ancestral environments in which our ancient ancestors lived, they presented problems, right? So we have to, oh, I don't have enough food. What am I going to do about it? That's an adaptive problem. So humans, over many generations, evolved adaptations to solve those problems. So I'm going to figure out how to use tools so that I can get access to this food source that I didn't have before, right? So that's the idea that we're talking about. So there are all sorts of evolved adaptations. Smell and taste, for instance. We don't have to smell. We don't have to taste. But smell and taste are adaptive because they help us know which foods to eat and which foods to avoid. If I say, ooh, this smells spoiled, I better not eat this, or ugh, that smells like poison, or that tastes bitter, that helps protect me and makes me more likely to be able to survive and pass on my genetic code to offspring. Let's see what else. Conditioned taste aversion is another example. You avoid foods that have made you sick before. That has helped our ancestors survive. Things like that. Right? So those are adaptations that we have evolved over many, many generations. The problem is, however, that our bodies are not evolved to adapt to a modern dietary environment. Our bodies are made to, are evolved to be adapted to a situation 500,000 years ago, not how the world is today, right? Again, we've talked before, we are not evolved to meet the present day needs. We are evolved to meet ancient needs. Evolution takes a long, long time to catch up. So we're going to talk about some examples that I think are really interesting of how we are not perfectly well adapted to the current situation in which we find ourselves. So here's an example. In our ancestral environment, good food was scarce, and so humans adapted to eat more when food was available. When food is around and it's plentiful, I'm going to eat some more. I'm going to build up fat stores so that when times are lean, I've got some fat to fall back on. That's the whole idea of, eat a little bit more when you can. But there's been some really interesting research on this. Cornell professor of marketing and applied economics, this professor named Brian Wansink, he conducted research in which the participants ate tomato soup out of this specially designed bowl. So this, in contrast to a normal bowl, as you can see in the diagram over on the right, this bowl had a tube in the bottom. It's this hidden in the bottom. It's very hard to see. And it was constantly refilling the bowl with soup. So the person would take a spoonful and eat it, and it would fill itself back up. It was subtle, right? It wasn't like, whoop, now we're going right back up to the top. So the person would eat, and the bowl would refill and refill. And the participants didn't get suspicious for whatever reason. But Wansink found two really interesting results. He found, number one, that people ate 73% more soup from self-filling bowls rather than people who ate from normal bowls. Right? So number one, people ate 73% more soup when it was plentiful, when there was no bottom in sight. But here's the catch. They did not rate themselves any fuller than people who ate out of a normal bowl. In other words, they ate 73% more soup, but they said, I am no more full than that person over there who ate less soup than I did. In other words, here's the really cool take-home point from this. We use situational cues, such as how much soup is left in the bowl, to help us figure out how full we feel. So think about what that means. If you have a big giant plate full of food, you might have this desire to eat until your plate is empty or almost empty because you're eating a plate full of food. If you have a smaller plate, your brain, when you finish that smaller plate of food, your brain says, okay, I'm done. I'm full because I have completed this task of eating. So it's a very different set of situational cues. So we do indeed use situational cues and not just internal feelings of fullness to say, okay, I'm done now. Incidentally, I think this is kind of fun. Wansink won an Ig Nobel Prize in 2007 for this research. If you're not familiar with Ig Nobel Prizes, it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek way to recognize sort of silly research. Their stated goal is they provide an annual award for research that makes people laugh and then think. Right, so he won an Ig Nobel Prize for that. So what does that mean, right? So we have this ancestral environment in which good food is scarce. We eat more when food is available. However, our modern environment does not match the ancient environment. In our modern environment, in this culture, there's an excess of food. In the developed world, we have too much food, not too little. And so we have, if you look at portion sizes over the last 50 years, they have grown tremendously. If you ever want to eat like a reasonable sized portion, order the kids' meal. And even then, it's sometimes really larger than it ought to be. So we have an excess of food. That produces or increases the likelihood of overweight and obesity. Here's another example, again, based on the idea that good food was scarce in our ancestors' times. The adaptation that our ancestors created was a preference for high-calorie foods. Our bodies want us to eat high-calorie foods in order to give us energy so that we can continue to go about our daily lives, right? If you think about an ancient ancestor who was eating ancient ancestors didn't eat a lot of salad. because salad does not give you very many calories, it does not give you much energy, it does not help you sustain your goals of hunting and gathering, right? So instead, what do? Well, if you can eat foods that have a lot of sugar, that have a lot of fat, that gives you more energy. Remember, a calorie is just a unit of energy. It gives you enough energy to continue doing the work that you need to do. However, unfortunately, within our current times, we have a lot of processed foods that involve a lot of sweets and a lot of fats. And it's really, really easy to have access to those processed foods, right? Think about what you had for breakfast. And of course, we're not face to face in class here, but I would imagine that an awful lot of people had something for breakfast that wasn't au naturel, right? That wasn't a boiled egg and I mean, like, it's kind of hard to think about foods that were like a piece of fruit would be unprocessed, but most of the food that we would eat is processed, right? Like an Eggo waffle. You'd say, how many ingredients are that? Oh my gosh, right? Or some yogurt. That is a processed food. And so many of the processed foods that we have are high in sugar, they're high in fat. They're appealing to us. We like them, we enjoy them. But the problem is our bodies, again, are built on this ancestral environment, not our current environment. Our bodies aren't built to handle the extremely high sugar and high fat diets that we tend to feed them. Another example, our ancestors were faced with a high risk of contamination. We didn't have antibacterial soap, they didn't have real great cooking methods. Sometimes it was difficult to, wash their produce before eating it or to cook their meat thoroughly or whatever. And so what did we do? Excuse me, we evolved an adaptation that we avoid very quickly and very easily food that has any hint or whiff of possible contamination. We are very easily conditioned not to like things and conditioned to like other things. Nowadays, there's a really low risk of contamination. I mean, like occasionally you hear examples of E. coli scares and things like that, but generally speaking, our food supply is pretty darn safe compared to 400 years ago, let's say. Part of the consequence of this is that we prefer familiar tastes over novel tastes. We also maintain taste aversion for a very long time. Think about a traditional American kid diet. We're probably talking about chicken nuggets, peanut butter and jelly, right? Like I'm describing my own children's preferred meals. Spaghetti and meatballs, like my kids are true American kids. Actually, I make them eat other stuff, but they have very strong preferences. Again, our bodies prefer familiar tastes because we want to avoid contamination. Again, those tastes they happen to be high fat and high sugar. Our bodies prefer fatty and sugary stuff over non-fatty and non-sugary stuff, over novel tastes that would be healthier. So I prefer a familiar, unhealthy flavor over a novel, potentially healthier flavor. So if you've ever seen people who've never had kale, and you say, here, try some kale, they go, ugh, what is this, right? It's hard to get people over that initial hump. The other thing is about the idea of taste aversion. I mentioned that. So think for a moment, if you will, if you want to pause the video, you can. Think about a time that you have experienced taste aversion. I'm guessing most people have had that experience. I want you to think to yourself or write down your answers to a couple of different questions. So number one, how long after eating the food did you become ill? How many hours or minutes or days? Number two, how long did or has your taste aversion existed? Was it days and then it sort of wore off, weeks, months, years? Is it still something you refuse to eat? And then number three, how could you overcome that taste aversion for that particular food? Do you even want to? Okay, so again, how long after eating the food did you become ill? How long has your taste aversion existed? And how could you overcome that taste aversion? And do you want to? I'm guessing in this class, if we took a poll, we would have something like a third to a half of the class who have experienced a fairly strong taste aversion. And typically people are very willing to tell you, they're like, oh my gosh, this one time, so if we were face to face, we could share some of those stories. Generally speaking, we develop taste aversion if we get ill a couple of hours after we eat the food. Interestingly, we don't usually develop a taste aversion if we get ill 5 minutes after we eat the food. There seems to be this biological process that says, oh, well, it wasn't in your system long enough to make you sick. It must not have been that. If we throw up 5 minutes after we eat it. But if it's a couple hours later, your body says, maybe it was this thing I ate, even if it wasn't. Your body doesn't know. Again, body versus brain, it's kind of hard to use your brain to convince your body. Many times, taste aversion lasts for years. If you had it when you were a kid, sometimes you'll just refuse to eat that food ever later on in your life. It also depends a little bit on the specific food. Was it chicken and I'm now never going to eat any chicken? That's less likely to linger over years. But if it's a really specialized food, my husband has a vivid example of when he went to Fazoli's in, I don't know, like 1996 maybe, and he got this Submarino sandwich and he got violently ill a couple of hours later, and we're talking 20 years later, and he hasn't touched the darn thing. In fact, he's only eaten at Fazoli's maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 20 years because of that experience. In terms of overcoming taste aversion, if you wanted to, I'm guessing a lot of people just wouldn't want to. You say, you know what, that food turns my stomach, I don't even want to think about eating it, yuck. If you did want to overcome that taste aversion, you'd probably want to pair it with positive experiences. So, eat a tiny little bit with people that you like in a pleasant setting. And then you can work your way up to larger and larger amounts if you wanted to. We also know that, historically speaking, our ancestors didn't live very long, right? So if you think about people having children at age 12 and 13 and people dying by age 35, that's what we're talking about with our ancestors. They had really short life expectancies. And so we actually see a lack of adaptation here. There was not a lot of pressure to mate with people who don't get these chronic diseases because, frankly, they would die before the chronic diseases even manifested, right? Evolutionarily speaking, most of the people who might otherwise, if they lived to be 75 years old, who might otherwise have died of chronic diseases, instead, they died due to accidents, predation, starvation, exposure, etc., right? Disease, like temporary, like influenza, right? All these people died of all these other causes. So there was no selection pressure to find mates who were at low risk of these diseases. As a result, just in the last 100 years, life expectancy has increased really substantially. As a result, genetic markers for these diseases have not been weeded out through natural selection. And as a consequence of that, we are not particularly well suited for fighting off such chronic diseases. So we talk about these, pretty high rates of heart disease, diabetes, cancers, especially things related to obesity and the digestive system. And again, our bodies are, as we've talked about previously, our species evolved based on interactions with the world as it was long ago, not as the world is today. And so we haven't seen, selective adaptations that have gotten rid of heart disease because it hasn't been an issue until the last 100, 150, 200 years. So it'll be really interesting to see, we talked about this a little bit last time, it'll be really interesting to see what happens going forward. But if we could push the fast forward button on human evolution 100,000 years, would our descendants be much better able to deal with heart disease because of the current situation in which we find ourselves today? Finally, I want to spend a few minutes here talking about culture and how culture influences our eating behavior, our feelings of hunger and our eating behavior. Culture makes a big difference. Culture influences what you eat, when you eat, how you eat, with whom you eat, how fast you eat, the utensils you use when you eat, right? Like all sorts of different things go into this idea of culture. There are cultures where people get up in the middle of the night and have a little snack. The British have tea. Hobbits, if you're a Hobbit fan, have breakfast and then second breakfast and then elevensies and dinner and supper. Like they've got 8 meals a day or something, right? So culture really matters. Culture relates to, again, this idea of what we eat and how we feel about food. Culture strongly relates to eating disorders. So, as probably everyone here is aware, in Western cultures, we have this increasing frequency of eating disorders in developed countries. Partly because if you think about scarcity, right? Traditionally speaking, roundness and fullness was considered a really beautiful thing because food was scarce. Now, food is plentiful, and the thing that's scarce is thinness. So, eating disorders have evolved culturally as a sort of recognition that this isn't a difficult or completely unattainable state, and this is what I want to look like. Related to the idea of eating disorders is normative discontent. In other words, social norms about not liking certain kinds of food or feeling uncomfortable about food or feeling uncomfortable about your body. A recent study asked college women, how would you feel about buying a chocolate bar? And, a lot of them were like, that would be fine. Some of them were like, yes, that'd be great. But a full 10% of these women surveyed said, I would be embarrassed to buy a chocolate bar. I think it's shameful to do that. My social norms tell me that that's a bad behavior. Buying a chocolate bar, which should be a really enjoyable, pleasant activity. 30% of college women say, I would rather take a pill instead of eating. I would rather take a pill that gives me all the nutritional content instead of eating. So that really reflects the possibility of the beginnings of unhealthy relationships with food, to think about food is bad, food is an enemy, right? Rather than food is something that we all need, and food is, in fact, enjoyable. This last piece I have on here, emotional orientations to food. This is basically, how do you feel toward food? Do you view food as the enemy? Is it something to be suffered through? I have to eat this, fine. Do you view food in a utilitarian fashion? Okay, yes, I have to eat while I'm doing other stuff, but not really something enjoyable. Do you, excuse me, do you focus more on the hedonic pleasure of foods? This is sort of a funny thing about me. I've told you at the beginning of the semester that I love food. I am a total foodie. And by that I mean I love food and I'm not very snobby about it. I will eat just about anything. And so I have this game that I play with my husband in which I say, tell me a food. And he'll say some sort of food and I'll just go, oh, that sounds so good. Oops. Hold on, buddy.